This is a little short video about Chapter 4 in banks. And as I mentioned, we're going to be, as I'm going to mention this week in the assignment, we're going to start reading 5 for the, do a little, oh, there we go. Okay, we're going to start reading 5 for chapters 1 and 2. And we're going to be talking about that online. I'm going to kind of slow things down a little bit, and we're going to mellow out just a bit. So one thing I like about banks is it's got a really good set of resources in the back about different ethnic groups, however we want to use that concept. I don't even like to use, it's got things like Arab Americans, Jewish Americans, Asian Americans, good basic historical information, not so much information about the current situation. But the background's important if you're going to learn about a group. Chapter 4 in banks deals with generalizations, and you can see an example on page 93. It talks about organizing generalizations, which is the big picture, and allows you to intellectually analyze what is the state or current condition of things. And then the lower generalizations, like when it says low level, it's basically just a statement more or less of information or fact, nothing that can't really be challenged, but it doesn't offer much to work with. It doesn't give any details. The details are the stories of the different groups. And if you're going to teach kids, students about this, or adults or anybody, the stories have to be compelling. They have to be, any story worth telling has to have a point to it. And it's got to excite and engage the listener. And then it hopefully will promote discussion and more desire to be curious and find out things about the group. So low-level generalizations on page 93, it talks about, Puerto Ricans usually come to the U.S., seek better jobs, sometimes return to the island because of racism in the United States or disillusionment. It's a pretty basic statement of fact. It's not anything dramatic. It's so Puerto Ricans, as opposed to Mexican Americans came here, immigrated for jobs, and sometimes went back and forth. It's been happening for a couple of 100 years, or at least 150 years. And so those are generalizations, but those are really low level. So they don't talk a lot about, you got to have more. I mean, it's like getting somebody giving you powdered potatoes, mashed potatoes. I kind of like them myself. Most people don't like them. So if you go up to the next level, then it talks about not specific groups, but it talks about general issues, like most individuals immigrate to the United States for political, economic, or social opportunities, but some of this movement has been voluntary and forced. And of course, that's referring to the forced genocide or movement of Native Americans, the forced movement or intimidation of African Americans, and also of Asian Americans, and to some extent Hispanic Americans. So there are levels of coercion, of where people were either pressured or they literally were marched, as in the case of the Trail of Tears. If you don't know, the Trail of Tears was the President Jackson removed the Native Americans of the 5, what are called the 5 civilized tribes. I don't know all of them right offhand. I know Cherokee is one of them. And they were removed from North Carolina, South Carolina, to some extent Florida and Georgia, and their land, their land was taken and given away, and they were forced to move to Oklahoma. It was Supreme Court ruled against it, and he just ignored Supreme Court. A lot of people don't know that Supreme Court in history has been often ignored. It would issue rulings, but the rulings were not enforced because the president, who's supposed to enforce them, blew them off. So then organizing generalization is you want to reach a point where you make a statement that covers all of these situations, but it allows people to, you go from the general statement to being able to apply it to different groups and to see how they fit into the pattern. And obviously they all experience different things. So that's what generalizations are. Stereotypes are when you try to make that absolutely apply to everybody. There's on the opposite page, there are 6 different organizing generalizations about acculturation, intercultural communication, perception, racism, power, and immigration, migration. And it just says like all cultures, individuals and groups have moved to seek better opportunities, political, social opportunities, some have been forced. So that is the general organizing about immigration, migration that's what the statement is on page 93. And then you can look at others over here and see the same thing. If you look down, perception, racism, and power, racism, powerful groups holding racist beliefs, usually structure, institutions, laws, and norms that reflect their beliefs and oppress the victims of racism. What would that be? Well, an example would be African Americans not advancing to positions of authority, not getting judgeships, not being admitted to the bar or able to become doctors, or as you saw in Hidden Figures, African Americans couldn't get an engineering degree because it was structured in a way that they couldn't seem to ever get a degree anywhere. These are very useful. They help to organize your thinking, and they help to promote critical thinking with your students because they see the logic, they see the pattern. And it's always, everything about humans is patterns, whether metaphors or explaining in mathematical patterns, being able to organize their thinking so they're able to move from one thing to another and see the variations. It's like a spectrum, only instead of visual, you have to see it as rational thoughts being organized in a certain way. There's an interesting little drawing on page 100, and it shows a cone, and it goes from, it talks about these same 6 things going from level 1 to level 8. And as it goes up, it gets more and more complex. And so the generalization, the big organizing generalization would be, I guess, be at the bottom. And then as you move up, you add more and more detail to it. So if we were to talk, and one example they work with here is immigration, migration again, talk about organizing, intermediate, that's on page 101. And then gives an example about the Japanese Americans and moves all the way from talking about the forced internment of Japanese citizens in America during World War II, all the way down to a children's book as being an activity. So an activity is a direct application. Number 2 talks about Shi-chan, Yuki, and Mother how they felt when David and Father were taken away. So it gives you different, and I've got books on this. I have one, Baseball Saved Us, and it's about Japanese American kids that played baseball in the camps, and it kept them sane, kept them excited about sports. It gave them some kind of normalcy. It's horrible to think the United States did this to its own citizens. These aren't nationals from another country. These are citizens. Imagine if you found out you're a German citizen, a German ethnic group, and suddenly they came and took you off your farm and locked you up. We didn't do it in World War II because it was obviously very racist, because Europeans, they decided to overlook the fact that if they arrested all the Germans and Italians in the United States, there wouldn't be enough people left to fight World War II. There were so many Americans that were of German background that it would have been pointless. I believe even Eisenhower would have been placed under arrest. So, so these exercises are very good to read through. I like the generalization concept because it helps you logically design your lesson so that you proceed from the general to the specific. And that's why you have books to read. And when you get to the specific, that's where you make the change. That's where you get kids to pay attention, because the specific is the story, and the story is compelling, or it should be compelling. Talks in here about cognitive developmental approach to moral education. Goes from blind obedience on page 104 to individuals taking personal responsibility. And ultimately, just like it talks about here about civil rights on example on page 105, ultimately your goal is to deal with moral issues. It's not something that church decides and you stay out of it. You just teach facts. If you just teach facts, then I guess you could just have kids memorize information online from home. You know, they could just pass tests about bits of information. If the brain is not engaged and actions and controversies are not examined or challenged, you're doing no critical thinking and you're teaching nothing, and that's a waste. That's complete waste. The old learning the dates in history is a completely worthless, I believe, totally worthless exercise. 1492 is not a date in history to be proud of. Maybe if you're Spain. If you don't know that in 1492, the same year that Columbus sailed, Spain eliminated people that were Muslim and Jewish from being in Spain. They forced them out or forced them to convert, or they killed them, one of those three. So that's what that date is in history, and it's often recalled in history as a great time when Spain finally freed itself. But in freeing itself from Muslim influence, they turned around and immediately suppressed the very people who they claim had suppressed them. So what did they learn from that? Well, cruelty, I guess. You know, like an episode of The Walking Dead, you know, get them before they get you. Heck of a way to run a country, or an end of the world scenario. Little true false test at the end. It's kind of interesting. So this chapter deals with curriculum. What does curriculum mean? It means thinking about how you're going to present information factually, but how you're going to create, how you're going to demonstrate the details, and not stick with just statements of general facts like the Japanese were interned, African Americans were suppressed from voting in the 1950s and 60s, and time before that too. There are facts, but then what happened to change this? There was always going to be a moral movement. There has to be. If you feel that if a war was unjust, if a politician was unjust, if there's corruption in the city mayor, if there's economic inequities, which ultimately will be very damaging to your culture, to your nation, you have to look at those. You know, how do we solve this? Arguing that, well, that's just the way it is, and we're just going to let it run. That's usually how you get the French Revolution. Is the king was absolute leader of France. Situations got out of control. People were starving, and people got angry, and they got angrier and angrier. And when it exploded, it was just a catastrophe for the aristocracy in France. many of them were murdered. They were put on trial and then they were murdered. But it was, you don't want a country like that. You want a country where the pressure, if there's pressure to make changes, that pressure is handled in a reasonable way and accommodations are made to meet the needs of people. If the needs of people are going to be consistently ignored, and if things are going to be consistently allowed to build up and injustices, then at some point the system breaks down. It always does. I can show you revolutionary. Doesn't mean it has to be in your particular country or any particular country, but countries that don't meet the needs of vast numbers of people or it builds up, then they have a problem. And the purpose of a democracy is to give people input on that so that it can be dealt with. So I would just like to put that little plug in there for democracy. I think it's pretty useful. Okay, well, I'm gonna let you go because I wanted to. I did this video last night, but I got so tired at the end, I don't even know what I was saying. So I didn't save it. So you have this one. So I hope you enjoy it. And thank you.